Let me go ahead and get this started. I want to introduce to you the moderator of this panel. It's John Nova Lomax, and we're very excited to have him here. Houston is his home. For a long time, he was a writer with the Houston Press for about 11 years. Right now, he's a senior editor with Texas Monthly. And his list of accomplishments is extremely long. I'm going to send you once more to the QR code because I'm not going to read them all. This guy just doesn't sleep. He also won an ASCAP Deems Taylor Award in 2008. I'm very excited to introduce John Nova Lomax.
Thank you all.
Your own, buddy.
Oh, okay.
Moderate.
I thought everybody was going to get introduced. Okay. Well, I'm honored to be on this panel, and I'm very appreciative of being invited to be here, and along with two writers that I have greatly esteemed, and the immortal Johnny Bush. We're going to start things with Roger Wood talking about the raw and the cooked of Houston blues. And we've had plenty of both, and they both taste delicious. So go ahead.
Yeah, and if we can see if this will work, see if it'll advance. Yeah, we got it. Move on.
Okay.
There we go. You know, what we're talking about here isn't really unique to Houston, but it's a characteristic that's obvious to me in getting to know some things about what was going on in this city in blues in the 40s and 50s. And that's the tension that exists in a work of art between these kind of two extremes, the primal, the raw, the emotive, the kind of rough, crude expression of human feeling, emotion, anxiety, pleasure, whatever it might be, and then the more elegant, sophisticated articulation of the human experience. And we see that particularly. I mean, I think there's many people in this room. I see a lot of faces I know that in the 1990s, you know, got turned on to some legendary Houston blues musicians who started their careers here in the 40s and 50s. People like Texas Johnny Brown and Calvin Owens. And these guys really represent, in many ways, what the Houston blues sound kind of evolved towards. It starts, of course, with the raw, and we can move on to that slide of lightning. He's been mentioned several times. Sam Hopkins, of course, was born up near Centerville, Texas, but moved to Houston eventually and made Third Ward his home and lived here for most of his life. He's one of the major blues figures of all time, and as Joe Nick Petoskey, I think quite aptly said in his keynote address this morning, you know, the poet laureate of Texas blues. Lightning was a great guitar player who typically performed solo or in small combos in ways that just expressed whatever he had on his mind at that moment. And some of his early recordings, we've got one there. Joe Nick mentioned Lowland Cullum that discovered Amos Milburn and took him to California to record his first records. Lowland Cullum also took Lightning Hopkins to make his first records in California. And I can't see that. Yeah, it was 46 that Lightning began to record there.
And that was where he became Lightning.
That's right. And thank you for adding that. I can't see behind me, but I think that record label acknowledges Thunder and Lightning, doesn't it?
Right.
He was Sam. He was Sam Hopkins. And as Miss Cullum drove him out there, he was paired with a piano player named Wilson Thunder Smith.
Right. And
Smith had already arrived at that nickname from his very aggressive style of playing the keyboard. And if you saw what Shelley Carroll was doing in that previous set with that kind of honk that he was doing, that really clipped honk, you know, this guy was doing this on the keys, and since Sam Hopkins was going to record with them, said, well, we've got Thunder, we got to have Lightning. And while Thunder Smith is kind of a trivia footnote for much of blues history, Lightning Hopkins went on to become well-known all over the world. And as far as I know, if you go into the next, there is one state-approved historical marker to an individual musician in this whole big city. And it's actually not far from here. You know, we're at the corner of Main and Holman. You can't go straight through Holman because of the freeway, but if you could, just right over there near Holman and Dowling, you'll find a marker commemorating Lightning Hopkins. So for those of you who are familiar with his sound, he is the epitome of that raw sound. But there's a few others that I'll just quickly mention here. Joe Nick, I'd seen the title of his keynote in advance, and I knew he was alluding to the Juke Boy Bonner song. So I just have this CD cover from our Hooli here. Look at some of those song titles. If you're a Houstonian, you'll recognize some of these places. Let me see if I can see them here. You know, like, well, look at the bottom. Struggle here in Houston. You know, one of the lines when I met a guy from Japan once, he told me Juke Boy Bonner was his favorite artist of all time. And then he started asking me, what is he saying on that song? And what he's saying is, it's a struggle here in Houston just to stay out of Ben Taub. And of course, to a Houstonian, that makes perfect sense.
It sounds like a bento box to a Japanese guy.
Yeah, but and even to someone from Dallas or San Antonio, that probably like, what is he saying? Just to stay out of Ben Taub, what is he saying? But you see things like stay off Lyons Avenue, and by the way, I wouldn't recommend that. Lyons Avenue is a beautiful place today. But back when he wrote that song, he said, some cat will shoot you just to hear his pistol bark. You know,
you better not break a 20 after dark.
That's right. You got it. And our star that's going to be on this panel, as soon as I can wrap up, Mr. Bush knows that area over there because that's not far from Kashmir Gardens, where his roots go deep. But Juke Boy Bonner didn't live a long life. He passed away, I forget the year. Is it up there? Do I have his dates?
It's about 78.
Yeah. But he was an example. But if we go to the next slide.
My stepmother, my old stepmother told me that she attended his funeral, and she was one of about 7 people who was there.
Wow.
And it's an unmarked grave up there in a cemetery off I-45, or 59.
Yeah.
You know, it's just really sad.
Yeah.
You know.
And you know, he was a real poet too, like Lightning. He was mainly self-accompanied, sometimes guitar and harmonica, but really a wordsmith at taking the old AAB triad that blues originates with, you know, that form where you repeat the first lyric so it gives you time to improvise the rhyme that will come with it, you know. I mean, a classic example that we'll get to in a minute, you ain't nothing but a hound dog crying all the time, you ain't nothing but a hound dog crying all the time. And then the B lyric, you never caught a rabbit, you ain't no friend of mine. You know, they were working with that form a lot, which was real basic raw blues. But closer to home, I bet many of you saw perform the next artist I've got here, Little Joe Washington, Marion Washington, who achieved the nickname Little Joe as a young man by his ability to impersonate Joe Guitar Hughes. And people called him Little Joe, and the name just kind of stuck. If you ever saw Joe, he was a frequenter around this area right here. You frequently find him right around the Continental Club, right over here by HCC.
Leon's Lounge, everybody,
yeah,
everywhere.
And in Joe's music, you would really see that kind of primal thing, even as late as just a few years ago, that really goes back to the origins of blues. But Houston blues and American blues, as it evolves, isn't stuck with just those primal roots. The primal roots have a real appeal to them. We move on into some sophisticating things, and we can look at these next couple of slides, and the audience can read that for itself. The primal roots of blues are based on some real simple things, some basic chord changes. Even an amateur musician such as myself can, not well, but can understand those real raw primal blues because there's only 3 or 4 chords in it most of the time, and they're going to follow predictable patterns. Even an amateur wordsmith can sometimes improvise lyrically those primal blues because, again, you can stick with that kind of AAB model, and it really works. You can do some cool stuff with that. But that primal sound was immediately, as it was being recorded and documented, running up against something much more jazz-inflected and sophisticated that we're calling the cooked here. One home of that, well, going to the next slide there, that kind of sums up what I'm saying here about the sophisticated sound. But one home of that, the building still stands, and it's over there at the corner of Elgin and Dowling. And some of you know right there across from all that wonderful renovation that's going on at Emancipation Park, we have the old El Dorado building. And the El Dorado Ballroom opened in 1939, was owned by Claude and Anna Dupree. And in an interview, Anna Dupree said when they put that ballroom on the 2nd floor of that big, beautiful business building, her purpose was to create a, quote, class venue for African-American entertainment. And they achieved that. They had bands from Count Basie to Duke Ellington play in there. They also had regular house bands that were a training ground for Houston musicians. The Pluma Davis Orchestra was one of the house bands there, where countless musicians, including Calvin Owens, came up. Connie's Combo, I think Joe Nick mentioned them in his opening remark. Connie's Combo could be anything from a small group to a bigger group. Before Conrad Johnson had his Big Blue Sound, which became the name of his orchestra in later decades, after he had left Kashmir High School.
We'll talk about that a little bit.
He had his combo.
Yeah, and I've written a story about Gorey Carter. There was a session in 1949 at a studio on Lower Westheimer that was essentially Connie's Combo, produced by Conrad Johnson, lead vocalist and guitarist Gorey Carter. They did a song called Rock a While, and there is very strong evidence that that is the very first rock and roll single to ever emerge in American history.
Yeah, and that engineer was Bill Holford at that studio. Joe Nick mentioned the two Bills, Bill Quinn and Bill Holford, the early audio recording engineers in Houston who were documenting a lot of this stuff. And you're right. We'll move quickly through a few more slides here. I.H. Smalley, and I love his nickname. He was I.H. Hell Yes Smalley. He's one of the guys that I never got to meet, but he was one of the band leaders that regularly played at the El Dorado Ballroom that really represented that urban sophistication and flowering of the blues sound, stuff that wasn't stuck in the old, more simple forms where the blues began, but was really moving into jazz and early R&B and a much more sophisticated articulation. The Club Ebony was mentioned. I don't know if Lizette's still in the house, but there's an ad from the Club Ebony, which her father managed for a while over on Dowling Street. And if you look at the text of that ad, you can kind of get a sense. Some of you knew my friend, the late Jimmy T99 Nelson. In fact, many people in this room knew Mr. Nelson. He was performing there, and you see Jewel teasing Brown. Jewel Brown is still with us and still performing, and one of the great Houston players. There's some other photos of Jewel with her most famous employer for about 8 years. She worked with Louis Armstrong. And there's a photo, I don't know if it's next or previous.
I think
you've been by it. That's fine. And move on to number 16 there, because we're going to be transitioning from the venues into something that's been mentioned but has to be talked about when you talk about American music history or Houston music history. And that is the creation in this city of the first great recording empire owned by an African American. And that's what we typically shorthand as the Duke Peacock Company, owned by Mr. Don Roby. Roby started with the Bronze Peacock nightclub as his first place. There's a picture of Roby, and you see his dates there. The next slide, Joe Nick's already featured. It's Roby and his business manager, Miss Evelyn Johnson, whom I got to know well before she passed away, I believe in 2004, and I was able to interview her at some length. They're the business brains that operated the Bronze Peacock nightclub and did so well with working with musicians that Roby eventually closed that club and moved his record company that he had created over on Lyons Avenue into it. And since his club was the Bronze Peacock, he chose Peacock as the name of his first record label. Soon after that, he acquired the Duke label, and he had the Backbeat label and the Sure Shot label and the Songbird label. He was a mogul who did very well. And his record companies lasted from 49 to 73, when he sold all of his holdings to ABC Dunhill in California. And that's since been bought by MCA. So if you find CDs and things that are Duke Peacock music, they're actually put out by MCA these days. Roby is the epitome of that. And the star that launched that label was Clarence Gatemouth Brown. Now look at how he's dressed. Since Joe Nick touched on some of this in his opening, I won't dwell on it. But Roby wanted to present his artists, whether they were doing the Primal Raw stuff, as upscale, as progressive. This wasn't the cotton fields and poor old folks hanging on a shack.
Yeah, I heard a story from Andre Williams about when Little Richard was briefly a Duke Peacock artist, and Roby supposedly was being chauffeured around town and encountered Little Richard pushing a fish cart around. So Roby stopped the car and got out and grabbed a catfish and fish whipped little Richard across the face and said, "My artists are not going to be out in the streets selling fish."
Well, it must be true because that's the second time today we've heard that anecdote. That proves it. It's been verified now. But you're right. Roby had, I think, a businessman's sensibility, but also a certain pride, even though the civil rights movement hadn't fully come to fruition yet, a pride in what members of his race were accomplishing. And so he sought to represent his artists and his companies as folks that were sophisticated and not the poor old country stereotype that many people still to this day associate with the blues. But Roby's one example. One of the artists that wasn't born here, she was from the southeastern United States, but Willie Mae Thornton came to Houston and was based here for quite a while and recorded for Roby. And she, of course, recorded the first version of the song Hound Dog that a few years later would become a lot more famous, particularly with white folks, when it was covered by Elvis Presley. You see the record label there. And we've seen this LP cover already today. None of us coordinated our slideshows, but I think Joe Nick showed you Two Steps from the Blues, which is not only, I think, the epitome of the Duke Peacock sound, but really the epitome of what I'm talking about with that kind of urban flowering of Houston blues sound. You have wonderful horn charts, you have complex arrangements, but you've still got a little bit of the grit, that primal quality in Bobby Bland's vocals and the way Wayne Bennett or Clarence Holloman will bend a guitar note. And you've got that tension between the really clean, brassy punctuation of the lyrics and this kind of more raw, elemental blues tone.
I just want to shout out Joe Scott. He's one of the most underappreciated musical geniuses in American history, the band leader at Duke Peacock, who just seemed content to sort of stay in the shadows.
Yeah,
over there.
There's a photo of Joe Scott over in the pop-up museum at the University of Houston Archives, where they've got the Duke Peacock.
I've only seen one photo of him.
Yeah.
He was a good-looking guy.
Yeah.
And just move along. There's over on Lyons Avenue, not far from where some of us were last night. There's a historical marker to Peacock Records. I believe it's the 4100 block, in case you want to go look for that. And if you'll go on to 24, this was a shot my colleague James Frere made. I don't think we used this in any of our publications. I don't remember if we did. But these are some of the musicians that were hanging around to get a photo with Evelyn Johnson after another photo shoot we had done. Miss Johnson is there in the front reaching over towards the late, great keyboard player Teddy Reynolds. Teddy Reynolds is the guy playing the keys on all of that Two Steps from the Blues album. And by the way, as a side note, I once got to meet the British Rock and Roll Hall of Fame guy, Elvis Costello. And he said, "You're from Houston?" And he asked me about Two Steps from the Blues. He said, "That is the best LP ever recorded." And it's a Houston record. But you see folks in that photo. And well, that's okay. I was going to name some folks, but you see T99, Grady Gaines, Milton Hopkins, who was sitting over here just a while ago, but he's gone to the pop-up museum now. I can't name them all. Hamp Simmons is the guy with the sunglasses in the back. He plays bass on every track of Two Steps, and I won't strain my neck with all of them. Somewhere back there in the back is Calvin Owens. Can you recognize anyone else? Let's see. There's Conrad Johnson just to the left of the guy in the white hat. The guy in the white hat is the late, great Kenny Hebert. I'm not sure how Kenny ended up in that picture, but he did. I don't think Kenny did anything with Buffalo Booking or Duke and Peacock. But this was in '98. And when I really started meeting and getting turned on to Houston blues artists who were performing in the 80s and 90s, I moved here in '81. I was meeting some of these people. And in the '90s, there was a much more and more folks seemed to be becoming aware of and appreciative of what they were doing. And they weren't all Duke Peacock artists, but a lot of them tied back to that. And I think the legacy of that studio and what it fertilized, so to speak, or propagated, is still with us. And that photo of the three guitarists, the front of the old Bronze Peacock nightclub is what you see there. It's now the education wing of a Baptist church. If you can imagine that little architectural detail having a neon peacock that would flash, that was the nightclub. And Roby eventually closed the club. Today, the main building behind it is gone. That was the facade you entered, and then you'd go into the big room where the Bronze Peacock nightclub was. And you see Clarence Holloman, I.J. Gosey, Texas Johnny Brown. All of these men have now passed away. They were all good friends of mine and of many others in this room. And they were the ones that were really, through their playing and through the kindness of sharing oral histories with guys like me and John Nova Lomax and Rick Mitchell, they were the guys that really, they and others were the guys that really were kind of personifying this classic Houston sound of bringing together the raw and the cooked. And I think we have a few solo photos there. Texas Johnny Brown just passed away a few summers ago, and we miss him dearly. But he was so well known to so many of us locally. I think he's a good one to have in mind. And I wanted to end with a shot that ties into our next session, of our next part of this session. There's Calvin Owens. And Calvin Owens was a band leader. He was the band leader for B.B. King for many years, played the trumpet. You see him pictured there across the street from the El Dorado Ballroom. Through a project that my dear friend Rick Mitchell was involved in, and the guest artist I've been hurrying to get up here, Mr. Bush, Calvin Owens and Johnny Bush actually got to collaborate, which I think is a really interesting synthesis of this Houston blues sound from both sides of the tracks.
Here we go.
Thanks, Roger.
You can go to that if you want.
Oh, yeah. And we have CDs
Put your CD up there.
and books available from Mr. Bush, who we're going to hear from very shortly. And I'd like to introduce Rick Mitchell. Take it away, Rick.
Thanks, John. Also would like to thank John for acknowledging me at the beginning of his book, Dive Bars of Houston. He thanked me for supporting him in this project. We're all still here.
Couldn't have been that bad a dive.
I'm just basically going to set the scene for our special guest by giving you some background on country music in Houston. Like really all American music, country music comes from the miscegenation, really, of African and European musical concepts. People back in the hills, in the South in particular, you would have a meeting, of blues and traditional string band folk tunes coming from Ireland and Scotland. And when that music came to Texas, really, you had this frontier fiddle tradition with ranch dances and hoedowns, and then in Houston you had barrel house pianists and solo bluesmen, and the beginning of jazz. And you also had other influences in South and Central Texas, of course. You had the Hispanic influence and you had the Central European influence of polka music. And all of that came together in Texas to create the form of country music. It's defined as country music, but the people who were playing it didn't necessarily think of it that way, called Western Swing. Bob Wills, the king of Western Swing, always said his favorite artists were Louis Armstrong and Bessie Smith. And in Houston, the first Western Swing artist that I'm familiar with, there probably were others, was a guy named Shelley Lee Alley, at least the first one who recorded. In the 1930s, there was a fiddle player named Leon Pappy Self. He was also the fire chief of Houston for a while, and he had a band, I think it was called the Blue Ridge Playboys for a while, whose members included Floyd Tillman, Moon Mulligan, and Ted Daffin. There was another great fiddle player, I think he was from Beaumont originally, but he was living in Houston by the time I moved here, named Cliff Bruner. Cliff Bruner was the fiddle player with Milton Brown. Milton Brown?
Sounds right.
Yeah.
And his musical
who was Bob Wills' partner in the original Light Crust Doughboys. He was killed in a car accident. A lot of Miltons around here today. Yeah, I may think of the name, but anyway, Cliff Bruner was probably the king of the original Western Swing fiddle players. He was Johnny Gimbel's hero, and I was fortunate enough to meet him and hear him in concert. Also, Herb Remington, pedal steel guitar player who played with Bob Wills and is still living. He owns he makes pedal steel guitar players, Remington Steel. After World War II, the Western swing, the big bands kind of broke up, and a new form of music emerged called honky-tonk music. And Johnny Bush and I, in the book that we wrote, Whiskey River, kind of discussed the origins of that word, but as Bush called honky-tonk skull orchards. You know, a lot of them were they were rough places. Some out along the ship channel. He told me the story of how the song "It Makes No Difference Now" was written. Some guy came home from the service, found his wife with another man, and said, "It makes no difference now," and went out to the parking lot and shot himself in the head, which is kind of ironic since the song is always kind of this happy little song. In the 1950s, there was a record label, D Records. It was run by Pappy Daly, who Joe Nick talked about earlier. He was George Jones's manager. And it recorded a lot of the Houston artists, including Eddie Nowak, who Joe Nick also mentioned earlier. They did rockabilly, but it was mainly country music. The legacy of D Records is Cactus Music. The Daly brothers, Pappy Daly's sons, owned Cactus Music for many years, and now they sold it eventually to a consortium of partners, and it's still in business, one of the last great independent record stores. And you can see some of the historic photos on the wall behind the cash register. Another hero to a lot of the country musicians coming up in this area was Lefty Frizzell. Lived in Beaumont for a while. Johnny Bush told me the first time that he heard George Jones singing, I think at the Cook's Hoedown here in Houston, he thought, this is the greatest thing I've ever heard. It's a mixture of Hank Williams and Lefty Frizzell. Another country singer from Houston who moved to Nashville and played on the Grand Ole Opry for many years was Hank Lachlan, who wrote a great song called "Send Me the Pillow That You Dream On." Willie Nelson lived here for a while. He taught guitar. And as Joe Nick mentioned, he wrote the song "Family Bible" while he was living in Houston and sold it for $50 and said, well, if I could write one that good, I can write another one. And the song became a hit for Claude Gray. Johnny Bush was born in Houston. He grew up listening to all of this music, heard Bob Wills when he was very young. His uncle, Smilin' Jerry Jericho, was a local country singer who had his own radio show and had, back in those days, radio playlists weren't homogenized where you heard the same thing in every city, so you could have a #1 hit in Houston that wasn't being played on the radio in Nashville. And Smilin' Jerry Jericho had several of those kinds of hits, including a song called "Ragged But Right" that I think George Jones also did. So Johnny Bush wrote the song "Whiskey River" on a bus outside the Esquire Ballroom on Hempstead Highway. It's still a country dance hall of a different sort. Whiskey River, of course, became Willie Nelson's in-concert theme song, and he still plays it at the beginning and end of every concert that he does. When Willie and Johnny first met, they were living in San Antonio. I think they were both still teenagers. And Willie was originally the lead guitar player in Johnny's band, or at least Johnny was the lead singer. And then later, Johnny played drums in Willie's band. Then Johnny went on the road with Ray Price and the Cherokee Cowboys, which Willie had been in earlier. That is the essence of Texas honky-tonk, fiddle and steel guitar, that shuffle beat. To this day, you listen to George Strait, that's where he's coming from. And then Johnny went out on his own, came out from behind the drums, had a number of top 5, top 10 country records nationally, all of which went to #1 in Texas. And just as Whiskey River, his own version, was coming out, he experienced a tightening in the muscles around his larynx that went undiagnosed for several years. But he's trying to promote what would be his biggest record, and he can't hit the high notes like he used to, or can't hold the notes. He was eventually diagnosed as having a rare neurological condition called spasmodic dysphonia. And through exercises taught to him by opera coaches, and more recently, minute injections of Botox into the muscles around his larynx, he can now sing and talk. But when I first met him, when we started working on this book, he could hardly get through a phone conversation. This book, Whiskey River, Take My Mind, is subtitled "The True Story of Texas Honky-Tonk." And it's Johnny's stories. I helped him shape it into a book. But it's my conceit, really, that Johnny Bush's life story is the true story of Texas Honky-Tonk. These songs about cheating and drinking and heartbreak, he lived it. So please bring to the stage Johnny Bush.
Stick that in there. How you like me so far?
I'm not going to stop you. I was told to never ask first. Just violated a rule of journalism.
Is that on, Rick? I got with, before I get started, are you as cold in here as I am? And it makes me, my throat dry, so I've got my lozenges here so I don't bother anybody. When I first talked to Rick about writing the book, he kind of turned me down. He said, well, I don't know. Said, then a few years after that, not long after that, he said, we're going to have to write it because Willie Nelson won't remember it and Ray Price will lie. So we decided we would do it. Well, you want me to do this? What he called, in doing the book, I had an idea of writing a song called Cashmere Garden Mud. And if you don't know, Cashmere Garden is an obscure part of Houston where I was raised. And we had no facilities. And my mama and my grandpa dug a water well with a 24-inch Stilson and an auger. I'll sing the song. It tells more of the story than I can tell you right now. But it was... the southern wind blows through Cashmere Gardens with the smell of Pasadena in the air. Nothing good ever grew in Cashmere Gardens. Only bitter weeds and flowers of despair. 3-room shotgun shack was home at Cashmere Gardens, with a house out back and a shallow water well. Everybody lived the same in Cashmere Gardens, like a chapter in a Steinbeck novel tells. In that unforgiving land north of the bayou, even cotton failed to grow in that mud. Was that Cashmere Garden mud stained my memory? And that memory still lingers in my blood. Well, it was 1943, and the war was raging. And I remember being overcome by fear. It was the beginning of the age of atomic power. And the preacher told us all the end was near. In that broken promised land called Cashmere Gardens, where my mama's love for my daddy died. He never saw the signs of her leaving, or the hunger he could never satisfy. in that unforgiving land north of the bayou. Even cotton failed to grow in that mud. And it was that cashmere garden mud stained my memory. And that memory still lingers in my blood. And that memory still lingers in my blood. Thank you. Thank you. I don't know. It's about 1943, and we was raised out there. Like I said, we didn't have any conveniences of any kind. And I told you about my mother and my grandfather digging a well. And cut it a little bit short, I guess I could say that white trash would have been a step up for us, you know. We were poor and didn't know it, but I remember we hung our stockings up on Christmas Eve, and the health department came and made us take them down. Could y'all hear me all right up there? My dad went outside and shot off a shotgun and told us Santa Claus had committed suicide. So it was pretty rough. And after Mom and Dad got a divorce, I lived with my grandmother, and I was about 13, 14, and she said, "Young man, we have a curfew in this house." I'd like to describe her just for a moment. She was sitting in front of that old gas heater. She'd rock back and forth, and remember those chenille robes? And there'd be snuff spit running down that robe, and she dipped snuff, and she got on my ass for smoking. She said, "Young man, we have a curfew in this house, and I want you in here by midnight, because there's nothing in Cashmere Gardens open except legs and hospitals. So I want you in here. I want you in here before midnight." Well, one night I came home after that, and I thought she'd be in bed. She's in front of that old rocking chair, rocking back and forth. That Levi Garrett running out the side of her mouth. "Young man, where have you been? I told you about the curfew here. I wanted you in here by midnight, and here it is at 1 o'clock in the morning. Where have you been?" I said, "Well, I wasn't in no hospital." So I like to joke about the way things were out there then, but at the time, we didn't know conditions were that bad. That's all we knew, you know. I understand conditions are a lot better out there. There's nothing there anymore where we were. I'll tell you, the westbound was Jensen Drive. The eastbound was Lockwood. The southbound was Liberty Road. And the northbound was Kelly Street, which is now Interstate 610, I guess. And the only paved road was Crane Street. And the grade school we went to was a bunch of Army barracks, and it was a time that I remember very well. But this is another song I'd like to do for you. Am I running over, Rick?
It's okay.
5 a.m. I was in the woods with an old tow sack. By 6 o'clock, I'd made my trip to the rabbit traps and back. By 7 miles, had 'em dressed and fried in the pan. When Daddy lived in Houston and we lived off the land. They said that down in Houston, workers were hard to find. That a man could make his fortune there while we just scrape for dimes. The money was just waiting there for those with skillful hands. So Daddy moved to Houston and we lived off the land. They say they built the biggest ship that ever sailed the sea. But none of Daddy's money came home to Mom and me. We didn't know the reason, but we tried to understand. When Daddy lived in Houston and we lived off the land. Then the war was over. The old man never made it home. And I think that Mama knew he wouldn't come back all alone. It took a while, but now I know that it never was his plan. When Daddy lived in Houston and we lived off the land. When Daddy lived in Houston and we lived off the land.
All right.
Hey, John. Why don't you tell people about the old Esquire Ballroom and the circumstances, how you came to write Whiskey River, and then sing it for us, if you will.
Well, it didn't start there. It started in Nashville in November. Back in those days, we had a disc jockey convention. And I just signed with RCA Records at that time, the biggest record company in the world. And my producer, Jerry Bradley, he was Owen Bradley's son. And he said, well, all I want you to do now, John, is write a song. And I was mystified a little bit. I thought, well, guys like Willie Nelson and Mel Tillis and Roger Miller and people like that in this town, that great songwriters, you want me to write a song, because I'd written a few songs. So he kind of put the ball in my court. So I had a stopover going back to San Antonio, and it was in Texarkana, Texas, and I had a date. And when I woke up that morning, I had a line of a song called Bathing My Memoried Mind in the Wetness of Its Soul. That sounded like a Willie Nelson song. So by the time I got back to San Antonio, I had finished it. And I will get to your point. I couldn't talk for 30 years. Now you can't get me to shut up. So Willie Nelson's house had burned down at that time, and he was living in Bandera, Texas, which is northwest of San Antonio, about 30 miles. And I sang it to him on the phone. And he, with great enthusiasm in his voice, he said, I like it. And I said, well, reason I'm calling you and telling you about it, it only has one verse and one chorus. Country music songs have more than one verse. And he said, well, you've already said everything you're going to say. He said, I just turn it around and sing it again. So I put it with his publishing company. And it became a number 1 song for me. But now to get to Rick's part of the story, I was at the Esquire Ballroom, and I wasn't quite fond of one line of a song where Whiskey River let me hide. And I changed that. When I was leaving the bandstand, going out to the bus, it said, Whiskey River don't run dry. And I got chill bumps all over me. And I said, that would be the line in the song. So to me, it all came together. And I think that's what he's talking about, because until that time, I wasn't really happy with it, because that line was bothering me. Whiskey River let me hide. The definitive line would be, don't run dry. So that's where that comes. Anyway, Willie recorded it, and I'll sing it for you right now. I'm drowning in a whiskey river, bathing my memory mind in the wetness of its soul, feeling the amber current blow her from my mind, and warm my empty heart she left so cold. Whiskey River, take my mind, don't let her memory torture me. Whiskey River, don't run dry. You're all I've got, take care of me. This is the part I was telling you about when he said, just turn it around and sing it again. Which I think at the time he was telling me that just to get me off the damn telephone. But then I noticed, I put it with his publishing company. And since that time, he's recorded my song about 27 times. People say, how many of your songs have Willie Nelson recorded? I said, 27. Well, it's the same thing. But I want to tell you, friend, that every 90 days going to that mailbox is a happy one. So here today, I'm going to sing you another verse of Whiskey River I wrote especially for Willie. And I hope you like it. Willie, please don't stop singing Whiskey River. It's the only thing that's keeping me alive. Willie, please don't stop singing Whiskey River. I need those checks I get from BMI. Whiskey River, take my mind. Don't let her memory torture me. River, don't run dry. You're all I've got, take care of me. Thank you so much. You've been a great audience.
Country legend Johnny Bush, y'all.